Good evening, everybody. It's a nice night to be in at a webinar and out of the snowfall, and we're very happy you could join us this evening. My name is Leslie Wegener, and I am a member of the League of Women Voters of the La Crosse area. And on behalf of League and all of this evening's co-sponsors, we want to thank you for joining us for tonight's program, and we especially want to thank our guest speaker for accepting our invitation to educate us about the Civic Health of Wisconsin initiative and how we can build our skills in community engagement and problem solving. For those of you in our audience who are unfamiliar with the League of Women Voters, we are a nonpartisan political organization that encourages the informed and active participation of citizens in government. We also work to increase understanding of public policy issues and influence public policy through education and advocacy. The Civic Health of Wisconsin initiative is a nonpartisan, coalition-based effort to connect and promote civic health efforts across Wisconsin communities and the state as a whole. League shared the initiative's first Wisconsin civil health findings back in 2020, and you can still find a link to that report on our state website. We're very pleased that tonight's program will provide a preview of the initiative's second report that is currently being prepared for publication. And along with the most pressing challenges, we're going to hear about the most hopeful opportunities at hand for improving Wisconsin civic health. With that comes the disclaimer that the findings and information presented this evening are those of the initiative and not necessarily representative of the League of Women Voters or our program co-sponsors. So quickly before we begin, I just wanted to provide a brief overview of tonight's program. Our speaker's presentation will run approximately 30 to 40 minutes. At around 7:45 p.m., we'll move into a Q&A segment, which will be moderated by Catherine Kochmeyer, also from the La Crosse Area League. For the Q&A, we ask that you please use the Q&A button on your Zoom screen and not the chat button to type in your questions. Throughout the program, Catherine will be monitoring the Q&A screen and collecting those questions for discussion, which is why you may see them move off the main screen. We've asked Catherine to present the questions in the order of her choosing, combine questions that may be similar, or rephrase for clarity if needed. We are grateful to have such a large audience tonight, and we'll cover as many questions as possible as before time runs out. But we're also planning on saving all of tonight's questions for later follow-up with participants. So at around 8:20 p.m., we'll begin to wrap up with a few final statements and some additional resources. Tonight's program is being recorded, and the recording links will be available later on our League websites. And that way you can share or watch later if you wish. We'll post that information on our closing slide as well. So without further ado, it's now my pleasure to introduce tonight's guest speaker, Mary Beth Collins. Mary Beth is the Executive Director of the Center for Community and Nonprofit Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Mary Beth is originally from La Crosse. She earned her undergraduate degree in English, followed by advanced degrees in law and Latin American, Caribbean, and Iberian studies from UW-Madison. She combines decades of experience working as a teacher, attorney, and nonprofit director with a passion for advancing the well-being of communities, families, and mission-based enterprises. In addition to leading the center and directing its research, outreach, and educational mission, Mary Beth upholds the Wisconsin idea through an ongoing collaboration with the National Conference of Citizenship, serving as a supportive hub for civic engagement efforts in Wisconsin communities and innovative new approaches to civic health. Welcome, Mary Beth Collins.
Well, thank you so much, Leslie, and the entire La Crosse Area League of Women Voters, as well as the other chapters that co-sponsored this evening, and everyone that is giving of their precious time this evening to talk about civic health. I am very grateful to be here, and I hope that I can leave you with some great food for thought of ways we can all be engaged in what I like to refer to as a movement for civic health, not only in Wisconsin, but beyond. So I'm going to start sharing my screen. If you can all just give me a moment to get that set up. Okay, is the slideshow showing?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. So, what I'd like to share with you all about tonight is the civic health of Wisconsin and beyond, because it does relate beyond the borders of Wisconsin, why that concept of civic health matters and how we can all be a part of the movement. And I'll just point out my logos here. I am, again, the executive director of the Center for Community and Nonprofit Studies, and I help through that role to facilitate with a group of other organizations the Civic Health of Wisconsin initiative. So you'll see those references throughout the presentation, but I know those terms can kind of end up being a jargony soup. So I want to just point those logos out while we're here. So again, welcome and thanks so much for being here. I want to always, as I do with these sorts of presentations, give a little roadmap for where we're going tonight. I would like to provide an introduction to civic health, how we think about it at the initiative, give a little bit of background and food for thought on why I think it matters, and address that a little bit in context, a context that we're in right now that is a quite specific one. I'd like to do some information sharing on what we know about Wisconsin's civic health from the reporting that Leslie referred to in her introduction that we've been doing from the Civic Health of Wisconsin initiative. Tell you a little bit about what we've been working on through that initiative, and then really get into what can we do to improve civic health individually and in our communities. And we'll try to leave you with some next steps that we can all work on together, or in our communities. So if you could place in the chat, now that I've shared with you, or now that I've shared with you the roadmap, and I'm about to share with you a little bit where I'm coming from, if you'd like to share in the Q&A, not the chat, sorry, it's actually the Q&A, where you're coming from, however you interpret that, whether that's your community that you're coming in from, or the organization that you represent, or however else you might think of that, feel free to do so so your fellow participants know, or we know a little bit more about who's here. While you do that, I'm going to go ahead and give you a little bit of background on myself. You got a little bit of that from Leslie, but whenever I give a presentation on a topic this important, I want to make sure people understand that I'm coming at it with my own personal angle, and there are probably many other angles. There certainly are many other angles that people can come at this same topic with. And I like to just be kind of open and transparent about the orientation that I have to the topics. So you heard a little bit about my educational background. Things that I tend to be thinking about, working on, and teaching about include legal and social foundations of democracy, domestically, abroad, and historically. The notion of human ecology, which is actually the school that our center sits at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, the School of Human Ecology. Human ecology is not known by a lot of people, but it's a really important notion of looking at, through a multidisciplinary lens, what creates conditions for thriving for people. Communities, I think a lot about communities, third places, and the supports that people need to thrive. And then purpose-driven organizations. I've, through my work as an attorney and an executive director, and now at the center, I've done a lot of work for a lot of different kinds of organizations, and in collaboration with a lot of different types of organizations, but most of them have in common that they are purpose driven, whether they be nonprofits or informal groups working on things, or even social innovations and purpose driven businesses. But those are kind of the areas that I tend to be working on and teaching on in my work now. I am from La Crosse, and my mother and my two grandmothers were both members of the La Crosse League of Women Voters. So this invitation was very special to me. And my family goes way back in the area, and I still spend a good chunk of my time in La Crosse. I also kind of pride myself on being somebody that is a big aficionado of all things Wisconsin. So from whatever community you're coming from, I may have already had some great experiences there. And if not, I hope those are in my future. You heard about my academic background. I have worked as a teacher, an attorney, and a nonprofit executive director outside of the university. And now I really feel like I get to merge those roles in my work at the center at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And through our center, we have been one of the partnering organizations in our nonpartisan effort, the Civic Health of Wisconsin initiative. And I was a co-author of the first Civic Health of Wisconsin report, which we published in 2020. And we're preparing the second report, and I'm going to share with you about that tonight. So one thing I always talk about when I present or in our classrooms when we're bringing people together to learn is that I am an expert in my own experience. I have also had a lot of great exposure through my work to civic health themes, and I hope those come through tonight. But I really have humility, and I hope I always have humility that many of you actually probably have great perspective and just as equally important perspective, as is the case with really everybody else on the planet about this topic of civic health. Yesterday, I did a little teaser interview on WIZM, the local talk radio station in La Crosse, in lead up to this webinar. And the host asked me, "So, are you the main character of this webinar tomorrow?" And I said, "Actually, no, I am not the main character. The main character is everyone else that's participating because we're all the main characters in civic health." And I hope that that theme comes through as we proceed tonight. I also just wanted to acknowledge this evening that we are in a really acute and rapidly changing context with regard to themes of democracy and civics in our country. And I know a lot of people are really feeling that right now. My daily life over the last few weeks has been just full of conversations and work that are, really responding and absorbing some really rapid changes and things that are happening in Washington, D.C. The broader world is watching, and I've had a lot of conversations with foreign colleagues abroad, who are also, paying close attention. And I just want to, acknowledge that and encourage everyone here to think about your own unique orientation to what is happening. And you may feel about it very differently than other people on the webinar. And that's kind of what civic health is all about. But what we all really need to do, and what I want to encourage tonight, is that we all need to be a part of a movement for civic health, which allows for different perspectives, but does ask of us to be engaged and to understand as best we can an informed perspective about things. And I do believe that if we all do that, that really matters. So, what is civic health? We define it at our initiative as individual and collective engagement for communities to define and address public problems and work towards conditions in which all can truly thrive and which promote democracy. So, you see here a range of photos that are actual scenes from Wisconsin of people doing civically healthy things. Or maybe you would differ in your view of whether some of these things are civically healthy, but they're examples of the types of activities that tend to come up on lists of civically healthy behavior. Getting involved in nonprofit organizations, advocating for causes you believe in, contacting elected officials, volunteering, connecting with others in your community. The list goes on, and I'm going to share more about that. But these are just a few images that we grabbed from things that were happening in Wisconsin over the last few years. The concept of civic health can cover a lot of different themes and ways of engaging. And I'm going to actually list some out here, and I'm going to ask you to really listen carefully. These themes are going to come back. And one thing I'll mention on this slide is that I encourage you to have a pen and a piece of paper nearby, because there will be a couple of times where I'll ask you to sort of think and jot down some notes for yourselves, as I ask you questions that will kind of weave into our thinking tonight. So these are photos actually from my own personal life and experiences that I would consider civically healthy. And you see here images from La Crosse and Madison, from Timor-Leste in the Pacific Ocean, from Valencia, Spain, a huge paella festival with people on the streets, from Milwaukee, from a bluegrass festival in Rochelle, Wisconsin, a Day of the Dead parade in Milwaukee, meeting with Representative Nygren at the Capitol, volunteering on Martin Luther King Day at a school. So these are just, again, snapshots, but actually from my personal life, where I now have this wonderful gift from working on civic health themes that everywhere I go, I see things that really give me pause about the different ways that we as human beings all over this planet and in Wisconsin are engaging in civically healthy activities. And if we can kind of keep that thread going, we can really create a better reality for all of us. So some of the things that, are activities that we would include in a list of ways of engaging in a civically healthy way would include civics education, good media habits, understanding how to interpret the news or where to get the news, Voting, that's one that people usually think of right away, but it's certainly not the long and short of it. There's a lot more to it. Contacting elected officials, holding elected officials accountable for things you care about, attending public meetings, volunteering and donating, participating in community events, joining groups, talking to and helping neighbors, engaging with people who have different viewpoints than you. Sometimes it's definitely apt to protest or to boycott or use purchasing power to have influence. And certainly our history as Wisconsinites and Americans has been peppered with moments where people used all of these mechanisms to have an influence and shape our future. So, why does this concept matter? Why does thinking about civic health in this broad, sort of varied way matter? There's a lot of themes going on in our world in the 2020s that have really kind of, underscored the importance of civic health. You might recall, and if you look at the bottom left of this slide, a book that was published in the early 2000s called Bowling Alone. It got quite a bit of attention. It was by a political scientist called Robert Putnam, who basically made the case that Americans' tradition of joining in groups and working together in associations to build stronger communities was really declining rapidly. He calls it the collapse and revival of American community. And that book certainly got some attention at the time. But if you fast forward 20 years, we're seeing that some of those trends identified by Putnam have really ramped up with the onset of digital existence and social media, with a global pandemic that shut us all down and separated and isolated us. And then, statistically speaking, a huge spike in our distrust in each other and in American institutions, um, sort of backing off of kind of knowing our neighbors, and people moving more rapidly than they did in previous generations to different parts of the world or country that they don't have natural connections in. So these things are all very concerning. And I included the little doctor icon there because one of the really interesting things that also has been identified is that when we don't participate as individuals in these sort of social capital ways that Putnam talks about, our actual physical health declines. So these things are related. That's not actually why we call civic health civic health. When we call civic health, we're referring to civically healthy behaviors for healthy communities and a healthy democracy. But the irony is that there has been a really recent wave of research that has proven that civic engagement is actually directly linked to our physical and physiological and mental health and well-being as well. So these are all reasons why this topic matters to me and to many others, and I hope to you. Another thing that we like to point out when we talk about civic health in Wisconsin is that it is not only a Wisconsin issue. We've been seeing some really concerning trends in our global community in recent years. After a long sort of 20th century uptick in the presence of democracy on the planet, most of the think tanks that look at those sorts of metrics have identified a declining trend in the last couple of decades. And this was getting a lot of buzz, over the last 5 years. And I've included there specifically sources like the Harvard Business School and The Economist to point out that this is not just a particular side of the political spectrum that is kind of calling this out. Even those that are concerned about capitalism and the economy have pointed out that there is an identifiable decline in democracy that is concerning. One of the big headlines kind of themes that came up at the end of or during 2024 was that it was going to be a really big year for democracy on the planet. There were going to be a lot of major elections. And you see from that headline on the bottom that, democracy looks bruised but not beaten. So we're still holding on, notwithstanding some of those concerning trends. So we have what I call civic health whispers in our history. And I don't expect that I know the best précis on the work of these folks. And I don't expect that I've named all of the best civic health whispers throughout time. But ones that I think about a lot are Alexis de Tocqueville, who was a French scholar, sort of citizen scholar, among other things, that visited the early United States and talked about the way that when social conditions change in countries and communities, it causes stirrings and discontent that can lead to action. And that when you have a country at that time like the United States, or a context like the United States, that didn't have an established aristocracy in the same way as Europe, that can get pretty messy because there's no hierarchy that people are necessarily ordered in by or penned in by. And he talked also about how we need to balance individual freedoms with the collective interest, and the potential tyranny of majoritarianism. That if 51% of the people all want one thing, that can cause some pretty important uh, limitations if it's used in the wrong way for the other 49%. So we have to think about pluralities in a pluralistic society. But he mostly drove home the point that I think we should be proud of, which was that when he observed the United States at that point, he said the way that people were engaging in their communities was going to be an essential component of a healthy democracy. And he was really impressed by that. And so that's where this local concept of engaging in our communities can really relate to having a healthy democracy, and creating civic health more broadly. Hannah Arendt, or Hannah, perhaps is the way I should be pronouncing it, was a scholar who most significantly for this conversation wrote The Origins of Totalitarianism, and was really someone whose experiences through the Holocaust and being a refugee informed her perspective. But she talked about that we needed to be concerned about lawful means to authoritarianism and totalitarianism, that it wouldn't necessarily come in the form of an outside force, but it could actually come from within. And she talked about that disillusionment, hardship, and loneliness among people create dangerous conditions for this. And so some of those things I just mentioned about loneliness, isolation, living in our digital ways, being separated from each other, really come into play when you think about her theories. She also really emphasized the need to protect free thought, that when we start seeing people clenching down on, or tamping down certain thought and certain speech, that is really a concerning thing for civic health and democracy. Dr. Martin Luther King, democracy, he said, in the United States must live up to its creed that we were created equal. And I like to think about Dr. King because I think what Dr. King does, maybe more than everyone here, is really speak to the specific American experience whereby we had a constitution and we claimed to create a democracy, but we still had work to do 100 years later and more, to ensure that we lived up to what the intention of that philosophically really was. And so I think it's important here to just remind ourselves, and I always say this, is that I will never take the position that we have ever had a stage of super effective, perfect democracy. What we're always doing is working on improving what we've got and continuing with this experiment that we hope will continue and will improve, and that will continue to live up to Dr. King's vision. He also really emphasizes the way that full rights and access to participation matter a lot to really claim that you have a democratic context. Robert Putnam, again, I mentioned him before. Some of you might have seen his work in more recent iterations. There was a really popular documentary called Join or Die that goes through his legacy and his wisdom and talks about kind of where we are in the 2020s. But the takeaways from his work are really that when we have communities with what he calls high social capital, lots of connection, people working together on things, people connecting about ideas and across difference, what results from that is we have better government, we have more trustworthy institutions, we have more accountable institutions, and it kind of trickles up. And also, I want to underscore, after kind of bringing up some heavy and difficult topics right now, that he did do a book in the last couple of years that really made the case that we can have an upswing in the United States. And he lays out what I think is a very compelling case for that. So he does give us some, a little bit of detail on why we should feel hopeful about the future. So I would like to ask now if anyone else would like to volunteer in the Q&A a civic health whisperer that they have read or that they think really informs their viewpoint on themes like civic engagement and democracy. And maybe I'll just see if Catherine wants to call out any of the first ones that come in.
So far we have Reverend Barber
Okay,
offered as one, Mike McCabe.
great. Thank you for that.
Mhm.
Maybe if any others come in, we can bring them up again when we pause, but I'll kind of keep rolling if that's okay. Thanks for
Oh,
offering those up, folks.
great, thank you.
Okay, so the other thing I want to point out is we don't all have to be Robert Putnam to participate in this movement that I'm going to talk about. And we did actually a series with Love Wisconsin, a storytelling platform that has a great website with lots of stories of Wisconsinites on what we called civic health heroes. And so even these people that were featured on this series are pretty remarkable. And I wouldn't hold myself or any of us up to their standard that they set. But the point I'm trying to make with this slide and that series is that there are people like this high school student you see in the image who's an high school senior at the time in Platteville, who was really making a huge impact in her community with some things she was doing within her high school. And Ann Vang and Brian Jackson and the other featured civic health hero were all doing things that were very local in their communities, but certainly had an impact on civic health. And so I just want to underscore that we all can have that kind of a role in our community. And it doesn't even have to be behind a big initiative or anything that would be featured in a blog, but that just has a ripple effect on those around us. So I actually would love to give you all a moment now to just do that thing I mentioned that I'd be asking you to do before, which is sort of think in ink. That's a term we sometimes use in our classes. Just take a quiet moment to think about yourself and your community and country. And these are questions that I offer kind of in follow up to the information I just provided. So, do you feel like you're strong in any of these civic health areas? Is there one of these things on the bottom that you're really good and consistent at and that comes easily to you? Because one of the things I'm going to emphasize this evening is that we don't have to all be good at all of them. We just need to pick the ones that keep us engaged and that we're comfortable with and that we can sustain. Um, what might be your opportunity areas or the areas that you don't feel as strong and they're a little less comfortable for you? And then with regard to the community, your community that you live in or you work in or that you really call home, or the country, who do you think is a civic health hero? And what areas do you think we need to work on in your community or your country? So just jot some things down. Take a moment. You all are the experts in your own experience in those contexts. So I think what I'll have you do is kind of hold on to those. And then when we turn to Q&A at the end of the presentation, we'll pull those back out and see if people want to share about them. Or maybe these can be notes that will help you generate questions for that section. I'll leave it here for a moment longer so you can consider it. All right. So after kind of going through all this civic health, what's the big deal about it? Why does it matter as a general concept? I want to pivot now to telling you a little bit about the work that we've been doing at the Civic Health of Wisconsin initiative. As Leslie mentioned at the onset, this is a nonpartisan coalition-based effort that was really generated originally by a group of nonpartisan statewide organizations. Actually, several of them were at University of Wisconsin system campuses. So we had some folks involved at the beginning that were saying, we really should understand better what's going on with this concept of civic health. And that was in the sort of pre-2020 period when a lot of people in Wisconsin were starting to see, I think, a certain amount of polarization in our state and in our country. And there were folks around me and my predecessor at the center that said, there's these opportunities to report on civic health for your state that NCOC, this organization nationally that we've been mentioning tonight, can support. You can publish a report with them and you can get your data and find out how your state performs on certain civic health metrics. And so a group of us got together. We basically crowdsourced a little bit of money to help pay for the contract with NCOC, and we pulled the data together. And we did publish the 2020 Civic Health of Wisconsin report, and it was published in June of 2020. So people were already on lockdown, but we did get a little bit of media attention for it, did some interviews. And most importantly, it kind of helped us as a jumping off point to launch an initiative. Prior to 2020, I had gone to DC and convened with other folks in other states that were doing this kind of work already. Many other states had done it multiple times by the time Wisconsin even looked at it. And what everybody that had done it for longer told me was that the most important thing is not to report, but rather to use the report as an opportunity to take action. And so we decided that we wanted to do that, and we wanted to use this as a jumping off point. And so we formed this coalition more officially to start to tackle some of the ideas that were represented in the report, and look at areas that we could make a difference. And what we've done is actually kind of different than other states. Some states have decided to do one program, like we're going to do community dinners across the state of fill in the blank as our civic health intervention. But what we really wanted to do was understand better what was going on in local communities. We knew that there were many folks like some of you on this call that were probably already doing great stuff around civic health and communities. So we wanted to create more of a hub where we could connect organizations, learn from what they were doing. And if there were gaps in the landscape, then we would potentially step in and try to rally some resources and do what we could. From the first Civic Health of Wisconsin report, I would say what I often say is that there wasn't necessarily earth shattering information in this report, but it definitely gave us a good baseline about where we stood. So I think people probably already knew this, but Wisconsin had done better than the national average in voting in national elections. We were kind of on par on some of the other civic health metrics, like attending public meetings. We were seeing, though, some things that were kind of concerning in other areas. Like we were really focusing on the fact that there really are not civics education standards in Wisconsin the way that there are in other states. And we were seeing a very notable decline in local news at the time. Some of our other metrics were kind of in the middle. So again, it wasn't necessarily so much that it pointed out a glaring problem in Wisconsin, but it gave us a place to start. And so from there, what we've done is we've formed a steering committee. We're moving that committee into more of a broader based group. So actually, this is now already a little outdated, although we haven't officially transitioned yet. So I guess technically we still have our steering committee in place. We were really lucky to have the support of two ex officio members, the Lieutenant Governor's Office and the Superintendent of Public Instruction. They've participated all along. And just in case it's not clear, those offices are what will be involved with our initiative, regardless of who fills the seat and regardless of what party. So we're excited that we have that institutional support and that maybe over time we'll see folks get involved from both sides of the aisle. We have never had a budget per se. I just think it's important to mention that this is really an effort of organizations that care about this work, sort of putting their in-kind contributions forth. We are starting to try to fundraise a little bit more just to be able to uphold some of the programming that now we've been doing. But I think it was good for us in some ways to be coalition-based sort of by necessity and definition. And it forced us to all keep talking about the relevance of the initiative and why we were all still engaged. And sometimes I've noticed in my work that if you get a project budget and one organization owns that and runs that, it sort of disincentivizes that kind of intentional connection across organizations. We'll take some money now, but that was good at the time. So the activities that we've been doing, we have some information that we kind of collect and share with folks about civic health in Wisconsin. We've been hosting a biannual community conference, which is sort of like a summit for everyone doing civic health work across the state, should they choose to join us. We'll be doing that again in April of 2026. Civic health meetups, we conduct monthly and virtually, and all folks who are interested in civic health in Wisconsin and perhaps are working on it or perhaps are just curious are welcome to attend. You can get that information from me after we're finished tonight. We also hosted for the first time in August a civic health challenge where for a month you could get daily prompts of an activity to do to kind of flex your civic health muscles. and get used to those kinds of habits. And then we have a range of grant projects with partners that have allowed us to really go into some communities and do some cohort-based work and the like, with partners like Urban Rural Action, which is a national organization that partnered with us in Wisconsin, and they've done similar work in other states. So that's just one example. And then we have a network inventory. We kind of call that's what we call our listing of all the organizations that are doing civic health work in Wisconsin. And we kind of try to be a hub for folks to connect. And we certainly were that during the 2024 election cycle, I would say, because we had a lot of people saying, hey, I want to connect with what other people are doing about things. And we did host some convenings about that, specific to a safe and successful election season, a nonpartisan um, angle on the election, not partisan electoral stuff. So these are just some images from our community conference in April of 2024. I just wanted to share kind of like the visual because it really was a fun and engaging place for the day where we all got to connect across communities that had, at least those that were willing to come to Madison that day, and learn about some of the, sub themes of civic health. There is a summary report of the conference on our website, which you can check out. And in 26, when we do this, we're really hoping to still do the main event in Madison, but then have satellite sites all across Wisconsin where people can tap in for the keynote virtually and then do their own local conversations in person as well. And if you'd like to be involved in that in any way, please reach out to me. So I mentioned before, of course, we all just went through a really busy 2024 election season. I mean, even if all you were doing was sitting at home and watching TV like this, it was a very consuming 2024 election. But for those of us that were involved in thinking about elections and civic health, there was a lot going on. And we actually did not lead the charge on having a role in the 2024 election. There were lots of other groups that sort of were doing work in Wisconsin, but there were a couple of moments where people wanted to convene across a range of different efforts. And then we were able to help contribute to that. And so what we saw, these are kind of my observations from that, was that there was a web of pro-democracy and civic health organizations that were really present in Wisconsin. And the focus of their work tended to be on trust in the election, tracking of threats. There was actually a lot of concern about threats to election officials and other kinds of disruptions that might come up. So there was a lot of scenario planning happening for that and communication strategies about like trusted election information so that people could vote and know that what they were getting was correct and that the results of the election that were being reported were accurate and things like that, or that how the elections were going, I guess might have been a better way to say that. There was a big, as I said, focus on depolarization and strategies for constructive dialogue and de-escalation, with this concern from the previous years that there had just been an uptick in threats and really kind of, polarized and even, sort of dissuading dynamics in the community. There's some research that one of my colleagues, Mike Wagner at UW, does that says that a lot of Wisconsinites reported not even wanting to talk about or think about politics because it just had gotten too risky, kind of thing. What's good news about the 2024 election is a lot of the things that we're prepared for, like disruption of elections or conflict, or some of those more sort of, I don't know, concerning, visceral kind of things, none of that really was needed. I mean, the election occurred. People seemed to trust the results pretty much immediately. We didn't hear a lot of stories about threats, as far as I know. And so, some reflections on that are that it was a safe and trusted election. We did see, though, that we were sort of observing, like right away when the election was over, that we kind of experienced something that I think we experienced in 2016 and 2020, which is that it wasn't exactly clear where it was going during the election cycle, but when the election was over, we were in a new phase of media and information. So you might recall that after the 2016 election, there was a lot of buzz around, like fake news, Facebook sites and things like that. And I think in this new 2024 post-election, debrief, there's a lot of talk about which media like tracks are people in, and um, are we so detached from each other's echo chambers that we don't really understand what people are thinking about things and who's showing up in those spaces and who's controlling those spaces. And you all probably have a lot of smart reflections on this, but I just think it's true that each of these presidential election cycles, we continue to have this new awakening to the new media and information world that we're living in, and that's probably going to continue. I think we still see that education about how our democracy works and how some of these civics themes work is still a great need, both for students in school, but also for adults. Um, and, one of the things that's happening, I think, now is that a lot of those organizations that were working on elections are pivoting to their own concerns about the issues that they work on or fears about legal means towards democratic decline. And so while there's good relationship building that happened in 2024, it does feel to me like a lot of those organizations are now going into like different pockets of what to worry about now or what to think about now. I want to emphasize that for many years, there's great data out there that on many issues, we're actually not as divided as we appear in our sort of bifurcated America right now, which is probably like a whole other 3 webinars, but just I hope you'll take that point and maybe we can all investigate it further. Um, and I think there's a question a little bit of like, what will the nonpartisan or bipartisan landscape for civic health look like into the future, which I think has been a question all along. There's still a lot of concern among many people working on civic health about the same themes that I talked about in the beginning, even though we had a safe and successful election. So if you want to use the little dinosaur QR code to see what our Civic Health of Wisconsin page looks like online, you're very much invited to do so. And we'll also put that QR code up at the end of the presentation. So if you don't want to be distracted by that now, we'll provide it again. But there's some good resources there if you're interested. Reports, the inventory of organizations that I mentioned, a shared civic health events calendar that if you want to post events from your community, you can certainly do so. And then resources that you might use in your community, like there's some constructive dialogue resources and things like that. So I know that we're getting up to the time that we said that we might kind of turn to Q&A. I'm going to just take a few minutes to give you some information about the report in 2025 that's coming out here, hopefully in the next couple of weeks. And I want to just give the caveat that this is kind of a sneak peek. I mean, there are some graphics and things and charts that are based on data in some of the coming slides that I haven't put citations on. I have them, and in the report, they will be fully cited and you will be able to see the sources. So I just sort of give that caveat that like, this is a pre-report kind of presentation. So Wisconsin, we have some information on how Wisconsin has changed demographically and geographically. We saw some pretty significant effects on volunteering and social connection during the pandemic. And in Wisconsin, those were actually more acute than some of our neighboring states. We had ongoing strong electoral participation. In fact, the numbers went up from the 2020 report pretty significantly, and Wisconsin figures high in the national compared to the national average and compared to neighboring states. We also saw more competitive elections inside of our state, more competitive primaries and more competitive legislative elections within Wisconsin, especially. I think a lot of people are correlating that with the change in the maps that occurred fairly recently. So the notion being that like now people of different parties can run again in places that had kind of been set up to be so one-sided. There is continuing decline of local media, and there is continued polarization, which we attribute in many ways to media habits. We see that through some great research at UW-Madison from my colleague that I mentioned before, Mike Wagner. The more extreme, if you will, your media sources that you spend time with, the more polarized your views tend to be. So there's some important correlations there. We know that there remains civics education gaps, and the civics education space has been very difficult in the intervening years since the report. In Wisconsin and many states, there have been pretty contentious situations going on in school boards and teachers sort of struggling with maybe how to present history and civics information. And our communities, I don't think, have really finished all of those debates. So that's probably going to continue, and we need to sort of keep an eye on that. We also saw a lot of reporting, sadly, that election officials, librarians, even, and other civic frontlines folks, as we think about them, have been threatened and feel unsafe. We had a really great partner called the Bridging Divides Initiative that was doing consistent threats assessment and monitoring of that type of thing throughout the last year or so. And there certainly were concerning, there was a lot of concerning information, and there's a lot of self-reporting from those types of professionals that they feel concerned about it. And then we know that this epidemic of isolation and loneliness has hit us like everywhere else in the last few years with the pandemic and other factors as well. And one thing that really comes through in our demographic information in Wisconsin, there is Wisconsin through a couple of different interesting like filters, population centers, and the original tribal nations. But one theme that really comes through is that we are aging. We're aging in Wisconsin. So some of those themes about social isolation and loneliness, I think, come up differently and more acutely sometimes with an aging population, especially when those aging pockets are in places that are more rural and disconnected. And you can see from the map on the right that that is what is expected in many cases, that those will be in rural areas. Again, we did turn out really high in 2020 and 2024 in terms of eligible voter turnout percentage. We continue to surpass the national average, and we surpass our neighbors in our neighboring states, with the exception of Minnesota. Our older voters are the most consistent at a high rate, but we saw a really important uptick in the 18 to 24-year-old set in the 2020 and 2022 elections. We don't have that data for 2024 yet. In our local elections, you can see from that line graph that we had a big dip, and then we're kind of coming back. And we were higher than our neighboring states, and then we dipped below, and now we're bouncing back. So I don't exactly know what the causation for that would be, but that's what we're seeing. I'm just going to quickly buzz through these, but just to say that everyone kind of had a decline in attendance at public meetings during the pandemic period, so to speak, but ours was actually less than the national average, which might be because I think a lot of municipalities put their stuff online. We did have some pretty devastating decline in our organizational membership figures, and you can see the way that we're on the more problematic end of our neighboring states there. So Wisconsinites are declining in their joining of organizations. Now, we were always kind of rock stars in the volunteering world. This is what it looks like 2017 to 2021. We're beating the national average. And then we see that, oh shoot, I didn't time this correctly. But anyway, I'll get to what the big punchline is on that in the next slide. Maybe I'll just go forward and come back. But this is what happened to our formal volunteering from 2017 to 2023. We actually had the most significant declines compared to our neighboring states. And we still haven't recovered from that decline during the pandemic the way that we would have hoped to pre-pandemic rates. We are bouncing back though. So Wisconsin, for some reason, took a really big hit in that way. It's attributable to the pandemic period, but we took it worse than others. And I was getting a lot of calls about that. Like, what are we going to do about volunteer fire departments in Wisconsin communities? We're seeing these terrible statistics. And yeah, we're hoping for a bounce back. In terms of informal helping and charitable giving, you can sort of see where we figure there. And I'm going to go quickly because you can see all of this in the report. And I want to leave time for Q&A. One thing that I think is really interesting and relates a little bit to another trend I want to point out is that we're really strong with, did we stay connected with friends and family, even during the pandemic period? Yes, we did. Look at that blue line. But when it came to talking to neighbors and knowing our neighbors, not only is our statistic a lot lower, but it also declined during that period. So this relates to me for another trend that we see, which is that a lot of us are living in pockets and existing in pockets with people who we sort of are like-minded with. And maybe I have concern that this graph indicates that maybe, we're not connecting as much anymore with people that just happen to be our neighbors. We're sort of hewing towards the people that we have like deeper relationships with, which isn't totally bad, but I think we want to stay connected with our neighbors too. Here, it's kind of a busy slide, but the point I just want to make is that we're one of only 15 states that do not require students to take a government or civics course to graduate from high school. There is a civics learning coalition in Wisconsin that is working very hard on trying to advocate for that. And there have been recent bills proposed at the state legislature, nothing that has gone through in recent vintage in the last couple of years. It's also really important to consider where people are getting their news and learning about the issues. I've mentioned the decline in local media, but you can see here a really elaborate bar chart about the types of sources people are using fairly regularly. The one that really gets me, though, is just the italicized text on the bottom left, which is just what the slide on the right does not, the graph on the right does not capture, which is how many people are now getting their news from social media influencers. It's a significant percentage across the different data that I've seen. And for those under 30 years old of age, it's even higher. It's a pretty high percentage that people are sort of, quote, getting their news from people that are social media influencers, but not necessarily journalists. So I want to open it up here to initial reactions of this information, and remind you that the full publication is coming. And when we publish that, we're going to be publishing it alongside a toolkit for people to have conversations in their communities about the results of the report and what they can do about it. And what about it motivates them or makes them scratch their head or that they see in their local community. So for this, I'm going to once again ask you to use the Q&A, and we'll have Catherine monitor that in terms of any initial reactions or questions or things that don't track with what you're seeing in your community. Let's take a moment to do that.
Mary Beth, I wanted to start with a question kind of to follow up on something that you said on the radio the other morning.
Sure. And in fact, here's what I'm going to do, Leslie. I think a la our original plan, I'm going to stop screen sharing, and then we'll come back to the civic health habits when we've had a chance for some Q&A. How does that sound?
That sounds great. That sounds
Okay.
great.
Great.
I just wanted to kick off the questions, and one of the things that you said on the radio the other day was you thought maybe that people underreported in Wisconsin, underreported some of their contacts with their neighbors and that sort of thing.
Yeah, actually, that's the slide I skipped over, and I am going to go back to that just really quickly so that I can show you the visual on that. My bad ordering of the slides caught me off guard there. So this is the one you can see. Well, charitable giving is up here on the left. And then I had given that whole story about the formal volunteering and kind of how we were usually high, but in our rates, but now that has declined in a way that's a bit concerning, but we're hopefully bouncing back. But then here's informal helping. And this is the stuff that I have to admit, the 2020 report, if you go look at it, our self-reporting of informal helping in the 2020 report was pretty low not low, but it was lower than I expected compared to the national average, because I think of Wisconsin as a place where people are constantly shoveling each other's walk or checking on the person next door who's sick or taking a casserole to the church potluck or whatever. But
can I just, we're not seeing your slide.
Oh, you're not?
Yeah, we're not seeing your screen yet.
Oh, thank you for interrupting me.
Sorry for interrupting you.
No, thank you. It says
that you've started screen sharing, but it doesn't show the screen yet. Maybe unshare and start sharing again. That might help.
Okay, thank you. Good call. Sorry, we couldn't have a Zoom webinar without some technical something.
Now it's working.
It is? Okay. Yes. So that's funny because now I'm getting a notification that there's a problem on my end. But hey, if you all can see it, we're good. So now can you see this slide?
It's a second Civic Health of Wisconsin report sneak peek. Yes.
Yeah. So the bottom right is the one that talks about informal helping. So here, though, we do show that we're above the national average in the most recent data. And although our formal volunteering, as I just mentioned, declined, our informal helping actually went up. So I don't know how people might make sense of that. I think it could have something to do with the way that we behaved during the pandemic. Like we were maybe putting more energy into informally helping people and not volunteering formally, which actually makes a lot of sense. But that's what we saw. But yeah, I think what Leslie's pointing out is that I had this idea that the reporting in the 2020 report about that was that people had to self-report. Did they informally help someone? And so I thought maybe they're just being humble about how much they're really helping people, or they're not thinking of the things that they do as informal helping. You know, they just think of it. I don't know. We'll never know. So great. So I think now, any questions or reflections on the data that I presented or the information that I shared and general Q&A, we could probably open it up for that if that's okay with the host. And then I can pivot back to the civic health habit stuff that I want to share as what we can do about it before we wrap up.
Yes, we do. And before we get into those, I did want to go back to our list of, we had several more people who were posted as civic health whisperers. So I wanted to share that with you. We had a
Yeah.
couple of people who voted for Richard Kite, who is a local professor of ethics at Viterbo University, but also Jimmy Carter, Eleanor Roosevelt, John Meacham, Yuval Noah Harari, and Bill Moyers. So wanted to share that list with you.
Great ones. We should make a report about civic health whisperers. We should make a
We should.
list.
We should.
That's great.
So there are a couple of comments related to, there was a comment earlier while you were speaking about the civics requirement, and one of our participants said that the legislation in particular says that by 2030 to 31 school year, students will need to earn a half credit specifically in civics as part of their 3 required social studies credits. This is in addition to the existing requirement of passing a civics test similar to the U.S. citizenship exam. Another participant said that she was surprised that we did not have that requirement for government or civics class in high school, and asked, what can we do locally to change that?
Yeah. So clearly we have someone that's very engaged with the work that is being done in Wisconsin to change that and work on that. So thank you for that detail. I know the most recent bill, AB4, was introduced on February 3rd at an Assembly Education Committee meeting. I think that's the one in play, and that is the one that would stipulate that civics should be taught at elementary, middle, and high school, and would require that all high school students take a semester of civics before graduation. And thank you for pointing out, lest I be construed as failing to point it out. There is a civics education requirement of sorts, which is that they do have to take the exam. But it's left up to districts how to get students prepared for that. And I think my colleagues that are more expert in the civics education field would say that current requirement, we don't really know how it's going or if people are learning the stuff that they're supposed to. So the notion of introducing the requirement of a course statewide is what people in that world are sort of thinking is the next best step to try to advocate for at the legislature. And I think one of the complexities of that is that different people in the legislature are thinking about civics very differently. And so I think there's a question of how those debates will go.
Right. There's some follow-up in the chat or in the Q&A on this. One participant says Governor Evers' State of the State speech emphasized in the year of the kid, kids need to know about and include knowledge of action. I'm sorry, I'm not saying this right. Kids need to know about and include knowledge and actions of lack of civil education stats in our schools. Another who pointed out the first content said, civics cannot be summed up in a simple multiple choice exam. What should be done instead?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think this is an area of civic health as Wisconsinites that we could really get some traction on. One of my mentors in this work worked on the Civic Health of Illinois project long before Wisconsin did it. And one of the things they actually got out of their civic health work was that they did implement in the Illinois legislature civics education requirement.
We have another question on a new topic. And the participant starts by saying, this is good information for normal times. We are all in a state of shock from the deluge of outrageous appointments and the undermining of the rule of law in our democracy since January 20th. Where do we go from here? What can we do differently?
Yeah. Yeah, I feel you. That's what I was trying to kind of mention at the very beginning, is that so many people around me right now are oriented to the way you describe that in different ways. And yet, I think one undeniable fact is that things are looking very differently right now than they did even a month ago. However you view that, and my recommendation is going to be that some of the civic health habits that I will recommend are perfectly apt for urgent times. And people are going to all have to have their degree of how much they're willing to engage and in what ways they're willing to engage. So there's different customization, I think, for how people participate. But I think one of the things that is true is that when a lot of people feel like there is such and I think you use the word deluge, that there is a deluge of things happening out there that are so overwhelming or new that it can be very possible to just shut down or have overwhelm or to become hopeless or to not even know where to begin. You get it. Paralysis in the face of deluge. And I think one of the things that I find helpful about thinking about civic health across these categories and the recommendations that I'll offer for civic health habits is that I think we can choose things that we have the skills and the willingness to do and commit to doing those things. And that relies to some degree on believing that other people will also engage around the things that they care about and that they're comfortable with, so that we don't have to all own all of it. And that we can create what I'm going to show you, I think of as like a web or a network of this kind of behavior. But I think the biggest threat in my mind, and that relates to all of those civic health whisperers, I think they would all agree, is the biggest threat is that we disengage. The biggest threat is that we, in the face of anything we don't agree with, when it comes to like holding our government accountable or the decline of civic health, we need to stay engaged. And so, and I think sometimes the historic perspective is helpful, because there's a lot about the last 8 years, 20 years. I mean, I don't know where we begin and stop, like what's not normal times, because in some ways we've been in a long stretch where people have been saying that. And I wouldn't deny it. I have kids in their 20s, and I think to myself, I can't believe this is their voting age experience. Like, it just feels like everything that I took for granted as a kid growing up in the 90s or whatever, even though that wasn't perfect, but has changed again. So nothing is normal now. I think throughout history, people before us in completely different generations probably thought the same thing. Putnam talks a lot about the first Gilded Age and the way that the whole world sort of turned upside down during that time, and people actually responded differently than they ever had before because they were facing new challenges. So I don't think I have I won't use the term silver bullet, but I don't think I have a magic wand for presenting a very neat answer to that. But I do think that sometimes this information can sound kind of mundane and for normal times, but I think it also relates very much to building that web and network of engagement and improvement of our civic health, so that we might be able to get things to a place that we're comfortable with.
Great. I'm going to add a question on that topic of engagement. There is a major issue in all of our communities right now with youth mental health being in very bad shape. And a lot of that is also connected to adverse childhood experiences. And one of the activities that I've often heard a lot about that is a good antidote to that and helps children with building resilience is civic engagement. And I wonder if you could speak a little bit about what young people and even youth, but also even children could do to stay engaged.
Yes. Oh, I love this question. I'm actually teaching one of the classes I'm teaching right now at the university is on how community organizations do trauma informed, among other topics. But one of the things we're talking about is trauma informed care, and ACEs are a part of that, which was referenced in this question, adverse childhood experiences. Um, so I'm going to go through a couple of points that were in that question from my perspective. So first of all, civic engagement is good for physical and mental health of everybody, as far as we know. So this applies to adults too. And I think there's some question about like chicken and egg, like, you see a more healthy person and they can engage more, but people that feel like they have agency over their community and their surrounding circumstances are more mentally healthy and in turn more physically healthy, so they say, and also that they can actually have an influence on the circumstances that surround them. So this kind of gets at social determinants of health too, which all of these really interesting public health themes and mental health themes and community health themes are really merging with civic health in the most recent years. So it's a fascinating time for that. And one of my other mentors and people whose work I love, Constance Flanagan, she's emeritus at the university now, but she wrote a lot and did projects that I happen to have some overlap with at the university about how if you give kids an experience early in their life that shows them that they can do something civically engaged and have agency over their community. So a lot of her work would be engaging kids in like inner city Detroit on what to do about the water supply or what to do about like cleaning up the like water source in the neighborhood. And they've done research that shows that if you get young people involved in something like that early, their sense of agency and uh, their likelihood of continuing to civically engage goes up a lot. So that's another justification for programs like AmeriCorps and Public Allies and programs that take young, like emerging adults and get them right in that kind of work. The idea being that you're kind of building that future generation of leaders and people who just believe they can do something and not be despondent. Did that cover the components of that question?
I think so. That was actually my question. So
Oh,
yes,
great.
absolutely. I could certainly speak to scouting and campfire girls and things like that. That's what it was called when I was a kid. So yes, definitely. Thank you.
Well, and actually, can I just add one more thing to that?
Yes.
That is coming up a lot in the worlds that I'm in and the colleagues that I have, which is that to the previous person's question, that hinged a lot on like what's happening. I interpreted that question as what's happening in Washington, D.C. And I am here to say like civic health totally matters for that and for any other country on the planet and their central government. But there's also a thought that, if you build up the strength of your local community, that is also a very protective um, force when you are worrying about whether or not things will be calm or reliable outside of your local community. And I kind of meant to mention this before, but one of the things that I really value about my education in Latin American studies and going to the global South is that you do see how communities continue and lives continue. And even when like the notion of a constitutional republic or reliable like civility around government is not reliable, and we don't want to go to that point, but I do think like the protective nature of what we can do with civic health in our communities is something that is apt in the moment as well.
Thank you. Another question we received is you touched on media habits. What do you think the impacts of misinformation are on civic health, and what can we do to stop the spread of misinformation?
Yes, this is a huge topic. One of my big frustrations about the Civic Health of Wisconsin report is that we don't actually really have data for Wisconsin on this. I mean, we have tons of data like nationally, and we know what the trends are with what kinds of information sources people are consuming. But I think one of the challenges of it is that things are changing so fast that it's almost hard to like set up a study and know the right questions to ask and then conduct it, because even a poll, I mean, even quick polling, maybe we could do better with that. I'll have to talk to polling people about that. But it's a huge issue. It goes beyond misinformation for me. For me, it goes into even broader notions of what are you paying attention to? If you wake up in the morning and you log on to this thing, and the first algorithm you hit is telling you to be interested in this and this and this, and it keeps driving you that way, you might even be getting like kind of accurate information. But the thing is, you might think that like issue A is the most important issue in the world, and you're missing issues B through Z. So there's an element of like the attention economy, which is something people are talking about a lot. And we know that these things and the apps are geared to um, basically profiteer on our attention. And so they are organized and engineered to create rabbit holes for us to be sucked into without free will. I mean, just to be real. I think people asking questions about like who owns the media companies and what incentives are in it for them is really important. And it's so interesting because that was also an issue in the first Gilded Age. You know, if you think about the Spanish American War and like misinformation in newspapers. So I think there's also a lot of concern in the last election. It's like cycle with AI and deep fakes and things like that. So here's what I'll say. I think it relates to the civics education conversation. We need to teach kids how to discern this stuff. And it relates to us as adults coming up with media diets that are healthy for us. And it also relates to actually talking about civic health and the way that we can sort of improve ourselves in these areas and expect it of others. So like it could be awkward in the example I'm about to give, but if we had a friend or a family member who was only eating McDonald's and had like serious health concerns, you know, we would maybe muster up the courage to encourage something different. But I don't think we're doing that right now with junk on the way we consume our media. Like maybe we are, maybe some people are, but I think we need to really encourage people. I do it with my students and my kids a lot, you know, where I just say, you know, how do you initiate your news consumption? You know, like I'm not even going to ask you about your sources, but can you just tell me, are you going to a source or are you just allowing them to feed you the sources? So I think there's a lot of work we need to do on this, but it relates to the education. It relates to us being discerning consumers. Um, and we need to all train and educate to know how to do that well. But I think one thing too that's going to be a consistent concern is that the technology is moving faster than regulators or any of us can quite understand it. I mean, AI has already developed so much in the last 18 months. So we have to be the ones to decide, what are we looking at and why do we believe it or should we believe it? And we're going to just have to make that a community expectation.
Great, thank you. Not a question, but a comment on one of our previous conversations about civic education. And one of our participants said we need to let our superintendent of instruction candidates know that civic education needs to be a higher priority. So there's an action item for people. They'd like to do that.
There we go.
We have another question. This is from one of our panelists, actually. How can organizations adapt to be more appealing for people to join or volunteer? In line with Robert Putnam's work.
Yes. Well, so one of the big things that's changed in this period that we're talking about, maybe like late 20th century to now, is that it used to be that the United States had this really amazing tradition that reflected the de Tocqueville observations, where people joined into voluntary associations and they, you know, were the ones doing the actual work. And then we sort of now live in a world where more professionalized nonprofit organizations are the ones that are doing a lot of the work. And I work in that field, so I still see them as very important, both types. But I think one thing is that people should be asking themselves, like, is there a voluntary association that I could still join in my community, even if that seems like an outdated thing, or even if I need to form a new type? And then I think traditional nonprofit organizations, and we encourage this in our coursework, and the best practices about volunteer engagement would say this, should all be thinking about, is there a way that we can engage community members to do things with us? Maybe not to replace a staff position, but to do things with us other than just giving us money, so that they really can be a part of the community building of our organization. And that can also lead to a lot of other things. So I think I have good resources on this if someone's in an organization that wants to discuss it further. But I think rebounding from the pandemic and looking at the road ahead, which means that we're going to probably have some resource scarcity coming our way, if I'm reading the tea leaves correctly, getting creative about ways to engage some of that sweat equity of your local community in a way that they can reliably do, but it's not too much, but also has meaning and is not just mundane. I think that's something probably every nonprofit organization could be thinking about and benefiting from right now, and so could the community.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Leslie's giving me the signal that we need to wrap up. And so I know that you have some more slides that you would like to share that we'd like to go back to. So if there are no other questions from the audience, which I don't see in the Q&A, let's go back to your slides.
Great. So we got to the ones that came through. That's wonderful. So are folks seeing the civic habits for 2025 slide?
Yes, we are.
Okay, so this is probably going to be a list I'll rework and rework and rework again and again and again, but this is where it stands currently. And I'd love your feedback. I'd love you to push back or offer other ideas. But I think that all of us, much like we would do healthcare, rather fitness routine of some sort or another habit that we have in our life, should be thinking about setting civic health habits, and we can start in 2025. It's still fairly new in the year. So creating time and a plan for what your civic health habits might be. Thinking about like, where do you have influence and what's your comfort level with types of engagement? Maybe you don't have money to give, but you're willing to volunteer. Maybe you don't have you don't really find it appealing to go door knocking for a political candidate, but you're willing to give to a campaign. So I think just being real about what you're really comfortable with and where you have a sphere of influence is an important like pre-work kind of set of questions that we should all think about. I think then going to that last question about media, we should all sort of really think about a healthy diet of information sources. I try to start my day looking at a range of journalistic publications that I have selected to kind of go across a spectrum of the political spectrum, a global spectrum, all the way down to local. I'm not saying everybody has to do it that way, but I have found it really nice to just know that's how I'm going to do my morning. And I'm going to know before I get anything on social media or somebody mentions something to me that I've got a little bit of a stable base, that it hopefully represented a couple different sides of how people are interpreting it. I think everybody should think about buying a subscription to a nonprofit or independent media source. You're probably getting paywall blocked anyway on a lot of media sources. So pick one that you really think does a good job and support it and pay for the subscription. I do that with a couple of sources that I really believe in and value. Try to take a little time with some history. I think today, a lot of themes we talked about, we can find some perspective in history. I'll leave that there. I think you get why I would suggest it. Consider joining a group. Some of you are probably involved in many, many groups. Maybe this one you don't need to add in, but if you're not involved in a group right now, think about it. It will make your health metrics go up, as Putnam shares so clearly in the Join or Die film that we mentioned earlier. Think about spaces you can get into that would allow you to venture from your bubble. I mentioned it before, and I wish I had a better map to show you, but there is some polling from the Marquette Law School poll that shows that we're all living in areas that are even more like deeply the color, if you will, of the like-minded people like to us. So, a lot of us are living in kind of bubbles, and I think if you can go to some events or things where you might cross over some generations or viewpoints, that's a healthy experience for all of us. And I kind of showed some of those of my own experience on that slide with all my little personal civic health examples. And I've gotten a lot of joy and I've learned so much about it. I mean, I've learned so much sitting in a tavern watching sports with somebody with the exact opposite political position as maybe I would be familiar with, and it's funny how much you can learn in just talking to people if you feel comfortable with it. I think that can be hard right now too. Build a connection with somebody across difference. A lot of us have somebody in our life that we probably love a lot, and we don't need to like drill them about their views, but maybe if it's been hard to spend time with them because of difference, you could at least spend time and see if you can strengthen that connection and understand more where they're coming from. that informal helping thing, I think, is a great thing to think about. Is there somebody nearby you that might be a little isolated, that might just really appreciate a quick hello, or, a text, even a call? Stop by the neighbors and drop something off as a nice, act of kindness. There's just things like that that I think can build initial connective tissue right now. And then when it comes to the issues, I would recommend that you consider and plan for having a comfortable, sustainable, effective means of having your influence on a select number of issues, or maybe even one. So don't try to tackle everything. Try to pick one or two if you're really ambitious, more than that. But like the thing that right now you're like, I can't handle and take care of everything, but I can at least monitor this one thing that I'm really worried about. And then when you've chosen those issues, stay vigilant and engaged on the information, the good information that we talked about. Connect with, and if you can, provide financial support to a civil society organization that's working on your issue. So if you're worried about immigration policy, find the organization that's doing that, and then follow their information, because they're going to be experts in what they're working on, and you can cut a lot of like challenge out of what's going on with that issue if you believe in the angle that they're coming at it from. Donate, volunteer, get involved. That's a way to kind of keep up with your issue and become a more effective advocate. And then do those things that once you know about an issue and you're following it, that we can do as regular people. Hold your electeds accountable, call them, write letters. I would avoid, I think some of these apps that um, can generate things for you, they might make things efficient, and that's good, but also be aware that there is a phenomenon of people getting flooded with like the same exact AI kind of based letter or call. And then I think it gets ignored a little bit more than if it was like, oh, this person really, we're getting like 50 calls a day and they're all unique. So I would consider that. Raise awareness about the issue, take other action. Like if there's a need to protest in this outside of somebody's office and you're comfortable with that sort of thing, do it. If you just need to leaflet your community about something that is concerned, there's like ways that these civil society organizations can provide you, I think, actions that you don't have to come up with on your own. But things like calling our electeds is something we can do on our own, and talking to our friends is something we can do on our own. Use your purchase power. Think about boycotting companies or things that you think are contributing to the wrong things, and spend your money with the ones that are doing the right things. And then I really encourage finding your civic health circle. So mutual support for the things that you're trying to do. Think of one or two people that maybe maybe they don't even have to have the exact same views as you, but that might be also trying to engage, so that you can connect about what you're trying to do, what's working and what's not, and that you kind of hold each other accountable for maintaining those habits. Um, and then I think raising awareness about civic health. And then the one that I totally left out of this, that maybe I was assuming everybody here already does it, is vote and support candidates that you think reflect your values in your communities, and really commit to supporting good people running for elected office. Because I think one of the things about the polarized world we've been living in is that there's a real fear that good people will just not want to get into that fray anymore, because it's just too scary, and I hope we're moving past that a little bit, but I think we still need to support candidates that we believe in. And so the visuals on the right, and I will wrap up here, just show my concept of network theory at the top, and that idea of a web. So you don't have to own saving the country or saving your community, but if you do those things and other people do those things, we can create a web that will protect us. We hope. And I believe it, but I also, it's not a foregone conclusion. And I just want to remind us that Wisconsin, if we really have a strong civic health culture in Wisconsin, we can be an exemplar in this. I think we've got a wonderful history of rising to these types of occasions, and we are in community with people all around the globe that are also worried about these very same things. So we're not going to get to my last reflection piece, but I wanted you to think about some next steps that you could take, who might support you. These slides are going to be available to you, so I don't want to keep the league from their final announcement, so I'm going to stop sharing. And here's where you can stay in touch with me.
Thank you very much, Mary Beth. I hope I speak for everyone when I say thank you. And I also want to say thanks to everyone who's attending or watching tonight's program. We were hoping for a robust and thoughtful discussion, something that would invigorate all of us in the midst of this spring election cycle, to think bigger and to think creatively about how we can strengthen our local civil health. As the old adage goes, it's hard work, but somebody's got to do it. So with that, I just want to share my final screens, which is a reminder of where we will be posting the recording of tonight's program, and you'll find links to additional resources. Also, if you've got feedback about tonight's webinar, feel free to email us at the address that you see on your screen. And again, on behalf of the La Crosse Area League of Women Voters and all of our partnering leagues from around the state, thank you for being here tonight. Have a great night, and don't forget to vote.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Mary Beth.